Thank you for letting me come here this morning
Yes,
and
yes.
share your home.
My house is honored with your presence.
45 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
8:30 in the morning, Sunday, May 18th. One of the largest eruptions, explosions on U.S. soil in American history hits. Within about 3 hours, 15-mile high ash plume cloud covers about the size of West Virginia, almost 60 people killed in an instant. When did you get the call?
I was at work at LeVogue's department store in downtown Hoquiam. I worked on the bicycle and appliance side, and I had got to work about 45 minutes prior to the eruption, and we were listening to KGHO, and that was one of the local rock stations. And probably Reese Davis came on and said that Mount St. Helens had erupted. So my boss and the guy that actually was a bike mechanic, I did all the carryouts and stuff. We talked about that a minute, and then we went back to work. And about 30 minutes later, I got a call from the 803rd Armor's S3 Air. That's the air operations officer for the Armor Battalion. And I think it was Major Hodgeboom at the time. But he called me and he said, "Did you hear about the mountain?" And I said, "I think everybody in the world heard about the mountain." And he said, "Well, you want to help out?" Because he had taken me on several aviation reconnaissances while I was a scout in the scout platoon. So he called me asking me if I wanted to help look for people. And I said, well, I asked my boss, I said, "Hey, Dan, they want me to go help rescue people at Mount St. Helens. Can I go?" And he's like, "Get in your car, buddy." And I went out and I got my beat up 73 Galaxy 500 and drove out to the Montesano Armory, parked my car, and that's about the time Major Hodgeboom landed in a UH-1D Huey helicopter, and I piled on board. There was no crew chief on board. There was just the two pilots. And we headed east towards I-5, following the highway, and turned south right before we got to what's now the big Black Lake intersection. We turned south before then, and that's when we came up a little bit and we could see the steam cloud. And I was like, okay, this is interesting because we're still freaking 30 miles away, and this is a definite event. And we continued down I-5. We got over my mother's house in Centralia, and no cell phone set. I called her. But we continued south, and when we came over the Willapa Hills, and you could actually see the mountain, and it was steaming. It looked to me, so we're an hour and a half into the event, maybe 2 hours. It looked to me like it was still actively erupting, and it actually wasn't. It was just steaming. The explosion, which I didn't know the Mount St. Helens area too well, actually had already, all the main event had already occurred. But what I noticed was, looking west on the other side of I-5 was the Toutle River. Looked like God took a popsicle stick and just ran right through. There was mud and logs and dead animals all along the riverway. And we got up, I don't know what the highway exit is, but it was on the Toutle River, and there was a phone booth there, and we'd overshot the objective, and started to do curls looking for people. And I was sitting in the crew chief spot with a pair of binoculars, and one of the pilots spotted a car, a station wagon. And so the people were standing on the station wagon. They were parked in a grassy area, but when the mud had come through, it flooded the vehicle. So we landed maybe 50 meters away, and 3 people jumped off the vehicle, mud up to their calves, and came to us. And I took a water can and washed the worst of the mud off their feet because we knew we were going to be making more rescues. Loaded them up, and I'm going to say their last name, but I know that you're going to get rid of this when you actually put it up. But it was the Brenners, and Mr. Brenner was an attorney with the Attorney General's office, and this is kind of key to how we got paid actually during the Mount St. Helens emergency, because there's a lot more to this mosaic than us just going and picking people up. The governor would not declare an emergency because Congress would not go into session. And she said that she would not declare an emergency until Congress went into session. So we dropped off the Brenners, and I got the daughter, age 19, Cheryl Brenner, very pretty girl, interior designer. I got her phone number, and so we rescued them, and we made rescues. We made rescues until we needed to refuel, and I'm going to say that was probably 4 or 5 hours, and then we flew back up to, I want to say it was Chehalis, but we went somewhere and we got fuel retail. And in the meantime, every hour when we would set the chopper down, I'd take out the air filters and shake them out because they're full of frickin' dust and ash. Even though we were on the wind side of the eruption, we were still getting ash and dust from the mountain, and just from all the junk that was floating in the air.
That, and when it comes to helicopters, that's like a big that's a big challenge. Well, even nowadays with modern technology and modern filters, anytime there's an eruption, all air traffic has to divert hundreds of miles out of the way to keep from having those issues. How was the supply chain getting like replacement filters and
We didn't get anything. We did rescues for 3 days, and we didn't get any real support except for when we went back to Fort Lewis and landed up there. And that was when we went to sleep at night. We had some night vision, but it really wasn't too good. We didn't even have night vision goggles at that point in time. So the only night vision we had was the old PVS2 snooper scopes. So we couldn't do anything at night, not really. Very amusing point was when we went to the Toutle River exit there on I-5 to drop off the people because there was a payphone there. There was a state patrolman sitting there, and when we landed, the state patrolman walked up because he was the major got out of the chopper to show me how to take the air filters out. And this frickin' state patrolman comes walking up and says, "You can't land here." And the major looked at him and said, "Well, where do you propose I land?" And in the meantime, this family of 3 is looking at him like, "You're an idiot." But that was already a foregone conclusion. So he got highly annoyed, went and made some radio calls and sat in his car and sulked for a while. Hello, Donut. But so that was where we would drop off the people that we rescued.
And say that again. Where was the
This was at the Toutle River exit on I-5.
okay
And if I would have had my wits
Castle
about
Rock?
me, I would have looked that up ahead of time. Um,
Almost Castle Rock.
yeah,
Or
yeah, all in that area.
right.
Yeah, yeah, just a,
I'm and for our folks watching, I'm kind of partial to that area because I was my family was from Toledo area. I lived
oh,
in Toledo at the time of the eruption. I was 200 miles away on Whidbey Island, and even as a 10-year-old boy, almost 11, we could feel the shock from the
yeah.
explosion and hear the booms, and nobody could figure out what it was. We were all playing outside, and the windows start rattling in a way that they don't normally rattle, and my friend Mike's mom says, I wonder if that mountain blew. And as kids, we're all like, "Oh, that's 200 miles away. We're not gonna feel that up
Yeah.
here." Or well, guess what? We did, and we also got some of that residual ash up there, and found out the hard way. You don't write on the cars with
Oh
volcanic
dear.
ash. My good friend Rodney, he was a swear word for my aunt for most of her life until she passed away. She never forgot him writing on her beautiful green paint in the ash. But having said that, my father was also a sheriff deputy. He was part of the mountain patrol, so he was the group that they had oh the Chevy like Blazers that uh, he used to log there for several years. I knew a lot of that area as a kid because of like Camp Baker and those areas where they would, whenever they would log or have cedar bolts flown out of the canyons. That was kind of my dad, my grandfather's working area when they were
Yeah.
loggers. And so dad at that point made that full transition over to full-time sheriff deputy and was patrolling the red zone
Oh
when
dear.
yeah he was because he had logged all that area. He already knew all the logging roads and the trails, so he was a lot of overtime during that process. I had friends I went to school with who had lost their father in that eruption.
Serious.
From yeah, it was so it's a small. The thing about Lewis County and Cowlitz County is it's a small area, and we always say if you're not related, you will be.
Right, I get that.
So it was interesting years later when I come into the Guard and I meet some of you that were involved with the actual eruption. I didn't realize what a role that the National Guard had played in the Mount St. Helens eruption, and that was like one of the biggest. That was one of those drawing points for me when I joined, was knowing that hey, if my neighborhood has to go through another eruption or a flood or something of that nature, there's going to be a group of folks coming to help. Now, how many days straight did you go on this? How long were you?
We did the rescues, the initial rescues for 3 days, but they found out that there was no money for fuel. So the fuel that we used came out of our AT requirements. And that
Wow.
was how they paid for the fuel. Because again, Governor Dixie Lee Ray did not want to uh, uh, declare an emergency without approval from state Congress. And it's a big part of it is the contempt that the Guard is held in by the state of Washington. Emblematic of that was that National Guard units could not keep the bolts to their M16 rifles in their armories. We had to keep them in a state patrol office.
Wow. So a lot changed by the time I
Oh
came
yeah,
in because
yeah,
I
we
I
were
didn't.
held in absolute contempt by the politicians in this state. They passed laws deliberately to harass National Guardsmen. National Guard Reserve ID was not recognized in this state until after 9/11.
No, I was not. I was the piece that I was aware of. I did not come into the Guard until the year 2000. So I came in at a very different period. We had been a peacetime force. Uh, always share that I served with the last of the Vietnam veterans when we deployed at the beginning of the war.
Mhm.
And one of those things that I think caught me off guard was that uh, I remember my first time going to Fort Lewis to use my guard benefits and to use my ID card to get on post was that we were only allowed to go on post, I believe it was twice a month.
Yeah.
And after 9/11, that restriction was taken away.
Yes.
And we became, well, let's be honest, the guard was actually being deployed and serving longer overseas during the beginning of a war than active duty units were.
Right. Right.
Now, let me go back a little bit, and first I'll share everybody. I'm Brian Cahill. This is my podcast, God and Country. I'm getting the privilege to interview Master Sergeant Haggerty. Uh, some of you don't know he actually came across with Lewis and Clark back in the founding of the country and helped discover the Pacific Northwest. Uh, rode with the Buffalo Soldiers, um, carried Patton's books for him, helped change the tires on his Jeep during World War II.
Don't
And
forget Valley Forge.
Valley Forge. Yeah, he's done it all. He's seen it all. Thank you. For those who don't know, um, when did you go into the military?
January 6, 1975. Vietnam was still going on,
Wow.
and they were screaming for people. The day I enlisted, I'm from Dallas, Texas. The bus from Gatesville, which is the same thing as Green Hill, come driving up, and 40 very angry looking teenage boys got off, and the Marines got their first pick.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember those stories of those days. My father also tried to um, maybe deter time in Vietnam by enlisting into the Navy, but
Right.
He struck an officer and ended up getting orders for Vietnam anyway.
Right.
So there were sometimes your choices still lead you to where you don't want to go. 1975. So my earliest memories of television are as they're pushing the equipment off of the docks and the people being rescued
Oh my
from
God,
the
yeah.
rooftop. Those are, and Scooby Doo, of course, Scooby Doo. Those are my first images as a 5 or 6 year old that I remember on the television. So my father had already been home from Vietnam, probably 6 or 7 years at that point.
Right.
So you're at a point when everything is pretty much on socially on fire.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The big concern was if Congress was going to reauthorize us going back into Vietnam or not. And literally, sometimes on an hourly basis, that information changed. So when I went through basic training at Fort Ord, California, they were always talking about we were going to go fight Charlie, the Viet Cong. And most people don't realize the difference between the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars was the North Vietnamese regulars came from North Vietnam and were trained by uh, they had a regular military training program that actually was started by the East Germans. So the North Vietnamese army was actually a pretty professional army. They had tanks, they had anti-aircraft missiles. Um, I heard that they had anti-tank, the Sager anti-tank missiles. I can't remember ever talking to anybody that ever heard of those being used. But the North Vietnamese army was a pretty tough army. The Viet Cong were the irregulars that lived in South Vietnam, and they were literally the revolutionaries that rose up to throw off the reins of what they believed to be capitalist imperialism. And that was their war and their revolution and their business. Um, so, one of the things I was very aware of growing up was we always talked politics, but only around the dinner table. So um, my dad did 33 years in the Navy. All my uncles were in the military. Dad did World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He was a flat top sailor. He was a fueler. That was his specialty.
But no, was your dad disappointed? Like, how can I put that? My dad wasn't disappointed, but I had four grandfathers who served in World War II and the Korean War for the Navy. My father served for the Navy in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
and I joined the Army. Uh, and I remember that phone call saying, "Proud of you, son, but why the Army? Did you get that? Did you get that speech?"
No, not at all.
Or, okay.
Um, my brother and I were both brought up. In fact, all the males in my family ended up serving in the military.
Oh, right
It
on.
was just something that we were brought up believing that when you graduate high school or when you turn 18, you're going in the military. It was a given. Um, so, like I said, every male in my family ended up serving in the military. My dad and I were. Well, my folks got divorced when I was 10, and so you know, uh, a few years later, I go into the military. My dad didn't even know that I had joined the military for like 5 years afterwards. When my mom happened to mention, oh yeah, Patrick Alexander is out of the army and now he's a logger up in Aberdeen, and by the way, he's a sergeant in the National Guard. And that's how my dad found out that I had been in the military.
Wow.
So my brother, he joined the Guard too, and he joined the same unit. He went to infantry school just like I did. And
So infantry was your first MOS, or
no,
was it?
no, no. That we got to step back to January 6, 1975. So I walk into the recruiting office. Um, so I had my ASVAB scores and I had my 3 references to join the military, because if you were under 18, you had to have 3 references to join the military. And I had the 5-page packet that you filled out in high school. So when I walked in, the placement officer looked at my test scores and she said, "You can do anything you want." She said, "Your AFQT is 93. You can pick any job you want." She said, I had the highest combat operations score she'd ever seen. My combat operations score was 131. And she asked me, did you go to military school or something? And I said, no, I just read. And then when my dad and his Navy and Marine friends would hang out, I was the beer boy. So I got to hear all their stories and everything.
So you were picking up before you ever
Yeah.
left. So was it was the experience everything you thought it would be when you went through basic and NAIT? Is it
Yeah. Um,
because it was a lot rougher in the 70s?
yeah.
Well, yes, and I mean it was rougher, but even in the ranks there was a lot of shifting at that point.
Yeah.
What Now, every generation had it rougher, so I'm assuming yours was rougher than mine.
Yeah. Not institutionally, but we got smacked a few times. And a couple times I did deserve a kick in the butt. I got that a couple times. I got a smack upside the head. I We were running downhill, and the knucklehead behind me didn't understand that I actually knew how to scramble, and so he pushed me, and so I was able to pivot and recover the scramble. Well, I almost butt stroked him, and so one of the drill sergeants hit me in the back with one of the full-length cleaning rods. Whack! He says, "Both ends of that weapon are designed to kill." So that was the end of that, because that's how we did things. You got an on-the-spot correction. There was no, we got to write you a counseling statement. You got to go see the commander and all this other garbage.
I will say that was the interesting thing was my introduction to counseling statements was at basic training, and the advantage I think I had going in it, I was I was 30 when I went to
Yeah.
31 when I went to basic training. Uh, Watching um, all these all these soldiers getting written up for silly things, and it was actually pretty easy if you just kept your mouth shut and
Hmm.
didn't do the things they told you not to do. Uh, and I noticed with some of the drill sergeants, they would do the good cop, bad cop, and
Yep.
they would go through like, I know what you did. Oh, you can talk to me about it later, and go down the line, talking to the soldiers, and then having a fellow soldier go, "Well, I know what I did, but what did you do?" And I said, "I didn't do anything." I said, "He's trying to get us
Hmm.
to tell on ourselves." Well, sure enough, he went and told on himself and got a counseling statement. And I was like, why? But again, that difference in age when I went, uh, the younger soldiers didn't understand that process. I was really surprised that when I did go in, uh, how many of the soldiers couldn't pass the PT test.
Yeah, no
I
kidding.
was out of 500 of us. There were only 25 of us that passed that first PT test,
Really?
and I was shocked. Now the younger fellows could all outrun me, but the sit-ups and the push-ups, those were no problem. It was, but the advantage I had because of my age, I had a better run time for my age category, uh, in the sense that by the time I got into my later 30s, I had less of a requirement than the young soldiers when they came in.
Right.
Um, but I thought they would be doing circles around me, but I was introduced to that video game generation. Who This is right about the time when cell phones are almost getting ready to come out, but video games have definitely been a bigger part of culture by that point.
Right.
And I still remember soldiers trying to smuggle video games and
Yeah.
TVs into the barracks. That was a painful lesson for them. But it was, like I said, I was really shocked at that point how our younger generation, and I wasn't that old. Remember, I was 31, but I was just shocked at how I thought all these young folks coming in were going to be fresh out of football camp or fresh out of whatever sport activity that their school was involved in, and that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah.
So
See, I didn't play sports. I was a busboy.
you worked, you worked,
Yes.
you worked. So
Yeah.
there's that other piece. Is I mean I think a lot of my generation before, we had those side jobs that we were doing in school and during summers, and also coming from a logging background, I was setting chokers at 13 and 14 years old, and gassing up saws and getting equipment ready for the next logging job that we would have. My I was a fourth generation logger, so it was the army that actually helped me get out of the logging industry. So
Good.
it was, yeah, yeah. None of my I feel bad that my sons didn't have that experience, but at the same time, they're a lot safer for it.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't begrudge anybody that still have friends and family that are in that industry, but I also was here during the early '90s when the spotted owl hit, and a lot of us lost our jobs and
Yeah. Oh
and
my God. Yes.
livelihood.
Yeah. I was a floor manager at Kmart when that happened. That was the only year we did not. That store did not make a profit. We were a multi-million-dollar store until this junk science mythology called the spotted owl came along and destroyed the economy of Grays Harbor and any other logging community, Cowlitz County,
to,
parts
to
of Lewis.
Toledo and Winlock yeah, Castle Rock. We were all devastated by the mills that shut down, the timber production that ended. A lot of the folks were. I was amazed when I did go to college. I had went to college for 2 years on the dislocated worker program, and how many of my buddies from school that I saw from high school. So we've all been out of school for like 7 years at this point, and my friends from high school that I run into who also had lost their mill job or had lost their logging job or construction. I had a lot of friends that were in construction, and they had all lost their jobs, and now we're going to school to learn a new trade because the timber industry had shut down.
Right.
Now you get to make that. I'm making a big jump transition here. You work on probably one of the greatest natural disasters that the Guard participated in and helped and really, I think, put on the map what the Guard was capable of, what they do for homeland, not just security, but protection of helping out the average person.
Aid to civil authority is what that mission is called. And no, there was absolutely no coverage of the Guard's contribution to that at all. And that's why I'm so glad that you asked me for this interview, because my story may be the only story in connection with the Guard and their response to Mount St. Helens that is ever being told, because the lying press, and they were all, most of them were liars back then too. Since about 1970, most of the press have been lying leftists, and that's not my feeling. That is the obvious truth, just looking at the networks. And after Kent State, any favorable coverage of the Guard was completely discredited. So none of the wire services, television stations, radio stations, or newspapers that I have ever heard of said anything about the National Guard and their response uh, to civil disaster, civil emergency. The first time that happened was in 1992 after the Rat Creek hatchery fires up in Leavenworth. We were on the news. We were we got our picture in the paper, all that good stuff. We were actually praised for that. But until then, the press, anybody in authority, did not want to acknowledge anything that the Guard had to do with that mission.
I've shared with folks on here before that in '88 I actually did a stint with the U.S. Forest Service, and we were fighting a rough. It was a very rough fire, and we had been on at least 24 hours straight. We were on initial attack. We got there before the hot shots. We got there before anybody else. There was a Forest Service crew and a DNR crew, and that next morning, 18 of the 20 DNR crew quit.
Yeah.
Because of how long we had been. They were just. It was the first time in my life I had ever fallen asleep standing up. I remember shoveling the hot spot,
right?
and just looking at the embers, and all of a sudden, just boom, I fell down, hit the ground, realized I had fallen asleep, got back up, and then brushed myself off, and I look up and down the fire line, and you would watch us kind of like whack-a-mole almost. You just watch guys just suddenly drop, just all of a sudden, because they were exhausted, they were falling asleep, right, trying to put that out. But during that process, I was some trees were crowning out in front of me, and my fire hose. I'm like doing what I can with my hose. A helicopter is coming over, dropping water down onto the fire, and all of a sudden I lose all pressure in my hose, and I'm like, I look back, and farther up the trail, my hose, the hot spot that we hadn't got, had burnt through my hose. Mm-hmm. We pull back. Everybody pulls back off of the fire line. We're sitting there waiting to get some more hoses, to get more water filled into our little portable containers. And all of a sudden, like 30 or 40 of these soldiers come through our fire line, all wearing bladder bags. Mm-hmm. They're in their BDUs, but they're wearing hard hats, and they go through and they put out our hot spots behind us. And I will tell you what, that was like, I didn't know. I just, brought the Army, and it's like, well, the Army National Guard, they're here to help us, on the fire, and they were taking care of those hot spots. We were able to reset up our hose line, get back to the main part of the fire, and I was always thankful for that, just that little bit of reprieve. It was it was pretty inspiring. It would be years later before I would join. It'd be another 12 years before I would join, but that was always in the back of my head. And then I remember the Leavenworth fire, and of course WTO, and a few other events. Thought I was too old to join when I was trying to get out of the. I was still logging part time, working at Sears, and met a recruiter who told me that I wasn't too old to join.
Right.
I thought he was. I thought it was a recruiter being a recruiter. I'm going to be honest. I didn't trust what he had to say, but found out that they had actually raised the age limit.
Yeah. To
And
32.
yeah, and then I could do it. And I graduated basic, I think, right, probably just a few weeks before my 32nd birthday. So I made the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
But now, how many how many units were involved that you know of? How many guardsmen were involved in
Well,
that process?
one of the big problems was that the 2146, who was in that geographical area then. So they had Longview, Kelso, Centralia, Olympia.
Montesano?
No, not Montesano.
Oh, they didn't.
No, Montesano was Combat Support Company, my unit, 803rd Armored.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's
and
a little more history.
so I believe that your tattoos tell your stories, and they become your epitaphs. So that's the 803rd Armor Crest.
I will have to talk to family members, because I think Doc Hill, my cousin, was in the 803rd.
Really?
I'll have to.
And we're having a reunion, I think June 20th.
Outstanding.
But responded to fires. This was a planned operation, and I was logging. I was either logging or shake rat, one of the two. And I heard that they were going to form a National Guard firefighting unit up in Republic because fire season was coming up. I'm like, okay, that's a nice segue. I'll just freaking quit this job on Friday and then go up to Republic on Monday. I was a Sergeant E5, and 1982, we arrive at the armory, and you know where Colville is.
Yes.
So we arrive at the armory. I've got two other guys from the 803rd, and it was a kind of professional slapdash. So everything was on pallets. Firefighting gear, C rations at the time, MCIs, before MREs. So we got there before the armory even opened, and then the guy came in, opened the armory, we made coffee, and then we started. I had no freaking orders. All I had was a report place. So the first sergeant, he was an infantry first sergeant. I think his name was Hall. But the first sergeant shows up, and it's like, all right, all you guys are going to work for me. And there's guys arriving, 2, 3, 5 guys at a time. Armories did not have their own vans and stuff like that. You had a sedan, one sedan. So we're arriving, and he was like, I'm going to make you my second sergeant, because like I said, when we arrived, I'm like, hey, let's get the wrappers off these pallets. Let's find out what's here. Let's see if anything needs to get put inside. So we started taking care of that, and we had one DNR representative for, I think, 60 troops, and we had no control. And he'd take out a black and white photograph and be like, okay, you're going to go up on this ridge line. You're going to dig a fire break on the south side of the ridge line. Oh, and by the way, you're going to blow some trees down. So I'm 23 and all my troops are 19 to 21. And you're giving me high explosives and dropping me off of a helicopter in the middle of nowhere. So that
This
was,
is the wild. This is the Wild West.
yeah,
So it's right on.
yeah. So
Right
we
on.
were blowing trees down and shit like that. Um,
Anybody who were using debt line
yeah, we use
with
det cord and we use
is it
C4.
that so those that don't know, if you're in the Forest Service and military, there's this stuff called debt cord or debt line. Um, it's great when you have to make a real quick fire trail. Um, you roll this basically like a cable the length of the area that you're trying to make the trail on, and the rest of you usually go hunker down on the bus to stay away from any debris when they ignite this cord. And in seconds, it can build a fire trail that would take a team several hours to dig and build. So it just I think about all how by the time we ended our careers, all the safety briefings and all the things that went into place just to be able to move a vehicle from say Centralia to Yakima, and here they are just giving it to you in boxes
Yeah,
and
there was no risk
no
assessment.
just dropping off and letting you
Yeah.
go. This is the good
does,
this is the good old days. This is
does anybody know how to do first aid? I was a medic. You get a bag.
that's yeah. Yeah. So at what point do you start seeing the change in, hey, we're more serious about this, we want you guys to be more prepared for these type of events?
1986. There was a white paper. Um, the writing started in 1984 called Division 86. And it was a reorganization of the Army so that the president could not unilaterally declare war because every Army division would have National Guard components. Uh, so, in connection with that, we went from having uh, one active duty advisor per company. We were different. We were a combat support company, so we had the Scout platoon had its own Army advisor. The mortar platoon had their own, the Red Eye, and so on. But like the tank companies, they had just a few advisors, and they were just that. They weren't there to tell us how to train, but to evaluate how we were training at the time, which was good and bad because it gave a lot of autonomy to the good leadership in the military. And I was very fortunate being in the 803rd that most of the leadership I saw in the 803rd was really good to exceptional. And the people that were not good to exceptional kind of got pushed out. So if a guy was 8 up, he would never make E5. He wouldn't be kicked out, but he'd never make E5. Um, so in 1986, the the Washington Guard changed dramatically. We got a bunch of new equipment and funding. Um, I went to active duty NCO school in 1980, right before I went to Mount St. Helens. The fall before, I went to the 10-week 11 Delta Cavalry Scout course at Fort Knox. So in the whole state, there were either 4 or 5 people that were offered that were able to do that. It was pretty exceptional to go to an active duty course when you were in the National Guard system. But after 86, we were able to do all that.
That's, now it's I will say one of the things that has changed, it the Guard has gotten better at sending their soldiers to the active duty schools when available. Um, that wasn't always the case, even when I first came in.
Yeah.
Um, I remember just waiting forever to get those orders for air assault, and unfortunately, I was ran over and wasn't able to go. That's a whole nother story
Okay.
we've shared. But it was it was by the time I had come in, I was starting to see more and more soldiers going to active duty schools. Um, I just thought that was normal way things operated at that time. But after talking to the more seasoned soldiers, uh, that wasn't the case. In fact, it was uh, Command Sergeant Major Hayes that we deployed
Norman
with
Hayes.
explained to me that in Vietnam he went from E4 to E7, and he said in those days it was basically who survived or who was
Yeah.
left. You know, as your fellow soldiers were being killed or injured, you would get put up into the next rank because they needed to fill that position. And when he came back and came into the Guard, he didn't have any of the NCO schools, and so he spent months
Yes.
just going to PLDC, ANOC, BNOC, to get his certifications.
Right.
So that was also like a different. I was starting to see the real enforcement of schools as I came in.
Right.
Now we get up to uh, we get into the late 90s. We're starting to experience more floods, more fires in this state. Um, were you seeing better resources at that point?
See, and I didn't notice that there were fire season has always been a thing with basically every National Guard throughout the 50 states and the 7 territories. Um, so firefighting was always a given. Um, so it was what unit had their turn in the barrel. So like Rat Creek Hatchery, that was when things got away from everybody, and the guys that were already designated as firefighters were already fully engaged, and they were fighting a different fire in that region. But so 2146 mobilized, 2146 and 898 engineers combined as a single unit to go fight fires.
I could see a big use of, especially the engineers. With were they able to take their equipment?
No, and
Oh,
that was what
oh,
was.
that's a,
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know what the S3 was thinking. I know what I would have said if I was his operations sergeant, but I have no idea what the S3 was thinking. They had deployable equipment, decontamination equipment.
Were they using them more just for fire lines,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
okay,
that's all
okay,
we were
that's
fire
okay.
lines.
I've seen that with 81st a lot of times that uh, they'll be used for actual fighting on the fire lines.
Yeah,
No, that was the joy of leaving field artillery and going to an aviation unit. Was I worked with the birds a lot on the fires, so I went to several fires where I'm refueling aircraft that are using water buckets, and so it was a much different experience, from having been in the Forest Service, working the fire lines, to working on an airstrip, just refueling vehicles as it came back. So it was. Did you? How much of the fire line were you on? Did you go on that at all, or you know,
yeah,
were
yeah.
you
I
you're
was a
running
firefighter
you're
platoon sergeant.
you're running the I guess what I'm curious is, sometimes when you're the sergeant, you're the one sending the Joes out. You actually got to be on the
Yeah,
fire line with the.
yeah. I would never ever, no matter what rank I was, tell my soldiers to do something I couldn't do. When I was a gun chief, I battle loaded my frickin' 109, 56 rounds, 56 100-pound rounds. And I made my crew sit outside. I said, I want you girls to take a break because I'm never going to tell you to do something I won't do. And I battle loaded that sucker.
Right on. Right
Um,
on. That's no, that's and that will always make an impression on your soldiers. Any of you that are NCOs watching this, there does come that point where you need to let go of the work because the your young troops have to know how to do it without you. But there is something huge to be said when the leader actually when your troops know that not only can you do the work, but you can probably do it better. Uh, that will inspire it'll inspire those young privates and specialists to like, oh, I gotta really pull my weight, or I need to be able to do this as good or better than the sergeant. um, not every case, but it's huge when your soldiers know that you're willing to share in the suck of the job. So
right. And as an example, when we transitioned from the M109A5 howitzer to the M109A6 Paladin howitzer, I went through every training station and made sure I studied and I was a first time go. And I was the only E8 in the battalion that did that. And I'm not picking on any of the other NCOs, but that was the way I always thought. I always thought that when you were a master sergeant, the master came first. You were a master at every craft. You knew how to operate every vehicle. You at least knew how to turn on the frickin' radars. You knew how to work with your radios. Every weapon in that battalion, you should be able to operate that. Because if I always had this thing in the back of my mind, the way my Uncle Don became a officer, a commissioned officer in World War II, was because all the officers were killed. And he was an E6, so he became a lieutenant. An officer came down and swore him in and said, "You're the company commander now. How many guys you got left?" And he had like 70 guys left. And that always stuck in my mind that
you could be pulled to that position.
yeah,
It's and I mean, worst case scenarios prove that's possible. Um, you were in a unique situation though. You come into still technically a wartime guard. You go through that peacetime transition or Cold War period of we don't have a major engagement until 9/11. Now, just like before, what were you doing the morning of 9/11?
oh, that was exciting. I was on the South Side Bridge on my way to work when Major Beecham called me and he said, "I don't know what's going on, but there has been a terrorist incident. We need you up at the armory now." And I did an illegal U-turn on the South Side Bridge and made it to Olympia from Kazi in 35 minutes. And I got up there and we opened up the SIPR room, the secret room with all the secret communications, issued weapons and ammunition. We got, all we had was 9mm ammunition. We got uh, cases of machine gun ammunition and uh, or M16 ammunition, uh, which were distributed. And I'm still in my freaking work clothes. I'm wearing jeans, a chambray shirt, uh, uh, Carhartt coat, steel-toed boots, but I'm doing my thing. And other other senior leadership are filtering in, and Major Beecham was the senior full-time guy in the 2146, and he said, "Can I put you on orders?" And I said, "You don't need to put me on orders. I'm here." So he said, "Do you want to get paid?" And I said, "I'd appreciate that." And so he put me on orders on 9/11. And so every little detail that came up, um, they would send me on.
I think that's really where a lot of my active time started, or at least ADOS time began, was from 9/11,
Yeah,
because I was pretty much at the armory from that day on, or real close.
yeah.
Uh, you so again, you're seeing this trend. You've come from this wartime through this Cold War to all of a sudden we're we're now a wartime guard. This is the biggest transition for the guard really since
Oh, yeah,
since
yeah,
World War II. And
absolutely.
I try to stress this, and the thing that I try to share with folks
See,
is
you're
that
forgetting one, the Korean War. The Korean War, again, was predominantly National Guard.
now that I was not aware of.
Yeah,
That was and I have family members that served in the Korean War, so
right.
I did not realize that the guard members were uh, a big part of that.
Yeah. One of the Ranger battalion or Ranger companies, they didn't have battalions then, was, I want to say it was Illinois National Guard. Um, but most of that warfighting was done. Uh,
I know that we've been present in every major altercation, but I
yeah,
mean, on the level of, because on the level of like World War II, there were a lot of guardsmen
yeah,
activated, but even during the Korean War, though, I don't believe we had the numbers that we did until 9/11,
yeah.
when
And I agree with that statement. I have a book downstairs of every World War II battalion level organization that was constituted, and probably 90% of them are National Guards. That's from World War II. From Korea, it was, you're correct. It was probably a third to a half were, uh, you could pick either number for National Guards. But when I came into the Guard, I was surprised at how many people said that they were fortunate they set out the Korean War, because like California sent a whole division.
yeah, I didn't realize I had sent that many, because we and here's that mythology that goes through, is that, hey, the active duty gets sent, and you fall in on the active duties posts, and you take care of their equipment and their bases until
Yep.
they come home. That was not the case after 9/11. I mean, we were definitely, and I've shared this before, but even when we ended up in Kuwait, the active duty unit that we replaced left, came back, left, and came back a third
Yeah.
time. We were still there, and even they were like, I think at that point, a lot of the active duty folks were like, I don't know if this National Guard thing is for me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it gave a lot of our soldiers an opportunity to experience that active duty life and deployment. Um, but it changed the whole mindset of, I know from the point that I came out of basic training in AIT to shortly, a year later, 9/11 hitting, um, the mindset of the people that I first met when I came into the Guard was drastically changed.
Yes, I concur.
Um, and again, like yourself, I think that we had that advantage going over with the last of the Vietnam era veterans,
Yeah.
and those trained by Vietnam era veterans, and their advice was usually like the most sensible when we would go. Not that there hadn't been changes in that many years, but a lot of common sense things about, making sure to know where your weapons were, making sure that your equipment was ready, knowing where your battle buddies were at, your team members. Those were all common sense things that I think carried with us when we went over, and especially when we watched units that were. I, I'm trying to be kind, but they were ate up.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
that's
we,
just
we
the
got
word
the
I was
we
phrase I
we
was thinking
we
of. It.
get the Guard takes a lot of abuse in certain circles, but at the same time, I, we really were a lot more equipped, uh, a lot more. We had we had that military bearing and focus
Hmm.
from day one when we came into theater, and I don't begrudge the folks that were there the months before us, but there definitely was, you could feel the change in atmosphere as soon as we started taking over certain camps and posts, and just the security level was definitely a lot more intense
Hmm.
once 81st took over certain posts. Now you got to experience you got to experience all of that. What was going through your mind as you saw this change, and hey, we are going back to this model? um, were you glad to see it? Were you satisfied with what you had seen with the guard through the 80s and 90s, or
I was pretty confident with the people around me. And despite the personality conflicts, and a lot of them came to light when we went to Moab Station, when we went to Fort Lewis, there was a lot of freaking there. There were several fistfights, and not just PFCs and specialists. There were some fistfights, but I knew that at the end of the day, everybody was going to do their duty. Because when I came in 1975, um, 10 weeks of basic training in Vietnam is going on. And it's being beat into you every day that you're going to go to Vietnam. Congress is going to reauthorize this, and frickin' you're going to go to see. When I enlisted, I asked, what's the shortest time I can enlist for? And at the time, it was 2 years, but you had no choice of job or location. So I went in on an open enlistment. And the reason they kind of dangled that in front of you was because the Big Army thought, yeah, we're going to need 50,000 foot soldiers to go back into Vietnam. So it was guaranteed it was either going to be infantry, armor, cavalry, or artillery. Or if you're really lucky, combat engineer, and then you could go find landmines or be a tunnel rat. But by the time I got through basic training, I was a pretty well. When I joined the Army, I was fat and I had a stutter. And 2 weeks into that, um, after some individual training, I got over that. But I was physically fit. I was fat, but I could run. I could make like I made the run time. Um, the stutter got me in trouble a few times. And if you remember the parade step, change step march, when you're marching and you want to change step march, kept screwing it up. And Drill Sergeant Tabalno and Drill Sergeant Kalma took a couple hours out of their busy day to train and retrain me until I was perfect at that task. And they got me over my stutter.
that's that's an intense, for those that don't know, when you have two drill sergeants training you at the same time, uh your your level of retaining information kind of skyrocket.
Yes,
It kind of becomes a lot more intense, and a lot more focused.
yes. They called it stress training.
Yes.
So, getting towards the end of basic training, the guys from Fort Benning came down and showed everybody the jump school movie. And I thought, $55 extra a month? Hell yeah, I'll take that. Because I'm seven. Well, I wasn't. I was a stupid teenager. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. So I went to jump school, and because of insufficient demonstration of confidence on demonstrated lack of confidence on the 34-foot tower, and the guy was 110% right. But this guy, Staff Sergeant Santos, again, freaking, he said, do you want to do this? And I said, yes, I do. Because I never graduated high school or anything. And he said, how much you want? And I said, I want this more than anything in the world, Staff Sergeant. The black hat, he was a Staff Sergeant. And so he worked with me, and I got recycled twice. So I was in jump school running every day, and they like to run in jump school for 5 weeks, but I graduated. But again, getting towards the end of that, the um, the guys from the special forces came down. I knew I didn't want to do that, and all the guys I met that were going to be rangers, they were jerks. Um, but Pathfinders, man, that's cool. I don't know if you get any extra money, but man, this sounds like a cool job. So, being a moron, I raised my hand. So I did that for 5 weeks. So Vietnam's still going on. I'm on a bus pointed from Fort Campbell to Fort Sam Houston. I get to Fort Sam Houston. It's the week before my training class starts, um, and so I'm on holdover, and so for that week, the first sergeant, one of the jobs that we had to do was they were decommissioning some World War II barracks, and we had to take the glass planes out of that and put them on a pallet for somebody to buy them or something. Um, but in the meantime, we had our televisions outside in the covered training area, and they were on all the time. We didn't have CNN, but um, the all the networks were cutting in hourly about what was going on with the Vietnam War. And
Were they still doing the lottery at that point with the
no,
names and the
no,
birthdays?
no. You still had to register, but the actual lottery had ended 2 years before.
Okay,
But you,
73,
yeah,
73.
73.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah. But you still had to register, and they were pretty sticky about that. It wasn't. It tapered off after Carter. Um, after Carter pardoned the draft dodgers, and I don't blame any of them for following their conscience. After then, they stopped the emphasis on signing up for the draft. Um,
now see,
but
I was even in '87, I was terrified that I had missed. Like I was so worried about. It was a little bit different back then. We didn't have the internet, but uh, I remember being prepared to go sign my selective service packet or sheet at the post office. My birthday came around, totally forgot about it because I was celebrating my senior year for several months during that summer. And at one point, my friends were talking about, they were showing their selective service cards. And I was like, wait, where did you get that? Like, when you go, when you went and filled out the paperwork at the post office. And that panic hit me, and I that was probably one of the first times I was ever like responsible trying to get to the post office to make sure that I did the right thing, uh, because the weight of it hit me that I had not filled that out yet,
yeah,
and I was worried about going to jail and being in a federal prison and all the horror stories you hear about that. But it was at that point they really weren't. The government wasn't out searching for you in the 80s to arrest you for not filling out your card on time. I didn't know that, so I was sweating it clear until the time I put that paperwork into the mailbox. So,
see, and my brother had that little uh, uh, problem in his head for a little bit. Um, he enlisted in the Guard when he was 17. And so something came up, and he was like, oh my God, I never registered for selective service. And our first sergeant's like, don't worry about it. You're already in. So you're in the system. So that was, again, how things work because my brother enlisted in 78.
wow,
So,
they
like I
were
said,
already.
I got to Fort Sam Houston and our medic class fills. And one of the first classes, one of the first classes that it was half women and half men. Very bad mixture. Everybody was right out of freaking training, and there was a lot of hormones in the air, and we could not go off post for 2 weeks. So,
And
but
this is the days before sharp training
oh
and
my
sexual
god,
harassment training and all that. So I imagine how many, but uh, how many marriages came out of that.
the
So
there were no marriages, but the thing that they were really concerned with, because I didn't know this, I because of the luck of the draw, um, I ended up dating a girl that I was in medic school with. My very first girlfriend. I was her first boyfriend. And we, on June 20th, was our first, 50 years ago, was our date, our first date.
wow.
We're still friends. So, anyhow, so we're in medic school in Vietnam Falls. And people are like, oh my God. Because until then, everybody had their noses to the grindstone that this is going to get real. We're going back to Vietnam. So, anyhow, obviously that didn't happen. But after my,
That's gotta be like a big weight because I know in 2000 or 2001, you know, when I was going through basic, my understanding was that our unit was on rotation for Bosnia 2146,
yeah,
and I was like, when I joined, it was I did this to fight forest fires and you know, help with flood control, you know, and you're telling me as soon as I get home I'm going to Bosnia. You know, I just that's when the reality of what I
yeah,
had done had kicked in, and that was a little that was a big weight on my shoulders as I'm going through basic and AIT. But by the time I get back, it had been um, I think our rotation had been either stalled or um, other units were chosen besides ours. Then again, 9/11 was just around the corner too, so it all worked out in its own way. But to have Vietnam, where I mean, I like I said, even as a small child, I can remember the impact of that
right,
as a kid. You were a teenager going through it. This is technically your generation's, you know, potential World War II uh, chance to serve. But the difference is Vietnam doesn't have the support, doesn't have uh, the nation is kind of turning on
yeah,
itself
absolutely,
over this war. My own father had told my brothers and I that he would personally take us to Canada if another Vietnam happened.
right,
And you know, Grandpa all served. Why wouldn't we serve? You know, we didn't understand. But when he explained the treatment of when they came home,
oh, it was horrible,
it kind of made sense to me of like, oh, like a lot of, you know, several of his friends didn't even like to share that they had been in the military,
yeah,
and that was such a strange, you know, Grandpa and his friends had no problem, you know, sharing about their time, but the Vietnam vets, I grew up with that generation of vets who just didn't talk about it. And
yeah.
then by the 80s is when all the really great, you know, the Platoon and Hamburger Hill and all those shows, you know, the glorification of Vietnam, and we're all back to that point of like, oh heck yeah, you know, we want to serve, or we would have helped in that. Well, then Desert Storm hits,
Mm-hmm.
and I know some guard units were uh, activated for, but it was over so quickly. I don't know if any guard units were there units that you knew that actually got deployed in that.
So, a brigade from the Louisiana Guard, and this is Alex Haggerty's opinion, and just that, was selected to go to Desert Storm. There's a lot of variances in different states' National Guards, personnel quality wise. And if you wanted to pick out the stupidest bunch of worthless ragbags, I mean, even worse than the California or Hawaii National Guard, you'd go to Louisiana. So they picked out the worst National Guard brigade and sent them to mobilization station because the Army was really upset that Division 86 had taken away their power to deploy only active duty units. So there were a lot of little crackerjack company and battalion size units that did things like ordnance, fuel, um, uh, oh man, anything logistics. Yeah, they took the Guard for that, but they deliberately chose non-deployable combat units and sent them to frickin' mobilization stations so they could say, "See, the National Guard just can't hack it." That's Alex Haggerty's opinion.
And for those that don't know, guard units, even within states, are just as much as the Army makes fun of the Marines and the Navy makes fun of. Well, I guess we all make fun of the Marines, but guard units make fun of each other's states too. And there's truth at times about what states units should not have been sent to certain situations
Yeah.
or deployments. I will say, uh, from a fueler perspective, I was impressed with the California Guard's fueling operations because they had uh, the 640th, but I remember that it was interesting learning certain fueling operations from them that we didn't do in our state, and it was one of those things where he it would be amazing to see what the guard is truly capable of sometimes, but the way that we're piecemealed out to different active duty units, it's a shame we never get to see the full potential of what a guard unit can do. Now, beginning of our deployment, um, and again, I this is one of those things that I share that I want the audience to know. We're the largest activation since World War II.
Mm-hmm.
3,500 of us get activated to to go on this deployment, and we get scattered to Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Feel like I'm missing a place, but I know 2146 in particular. We had at least three different areas that we were sent to.
Right.
Um, we protected the largest ammunition movement since World War II coming into theater. Uh, I remember that day at the S pod, or that week, I should say, at the S pod when the ammo ship came in. Uh, tensions were pretty high.
Yeah.
Everybody was very ready for it. Um, I can say that was probably one of those proud moments of knowing that you were part of something that was much bigger than
Right.
yourself, and knowing especially that ammunition was needed, that ordnance was needed in the places it was going. But it also was a very hard deployment on a lot of us, in the sense that we really were more in a support role and not in a when you train as field artillery for every training, every mission, every summer camp, and then you go and are basically either MPs or checkpoint guards. It's a little deflating to the ego of what you train for, and at that point you really get hit over the head with needs of the Army.
Yeah. Yeah. And a big part of that too is the bias of big Army. And the National Guard was not a separate department of the Department of Defense. We fell in under our respective uh, services until they formed the National Guard at the 4-star level. And that was a big thing that changed after 9/11. It was very favorable to us that at that point in time, the National Guard 4-star general could turn to the the Army or the chief of staff of the Defense Department and say, "I got troops that can do that." We didn't have anybody that would do that. Before then, it went through the Army, and the Army's like, "Well, I got this unit in Fort Lewis, and we're going to deploy them because you don't want those National Guardsmen. They're just too stupid and untrained." Which kind of gates into something that I don't think you ever really experienced, and that was my relations with our active duty uh, uh, advisors was on the best day civil. Um, there was a particular instance when Colonel Ling was the battalion commander. This was the year before 9/11, and I was the TOC sergeant, the battalion operations. I wasn't the operations sergeant. I was actually the intelligence sergeant. But the op sergeant worked full time, and he did other things. So I ended up being the guy in charge of the TOC, and we were doing um, active fire missions. And in the meantime, we're paralleling the fire missions on a simulation map. And Major Janae, who was our senior active duty advisor, said to Colonel Ling, frickin', I don't know why, called him by his first name. He said, I don't know why you're firing all those rounds, Grant. All you're doing is churning dirt. And it intensely chagrined Colonel Grant or Colonel Ling. And I went to full military posture, stepped between them, and I made eye contact with Major Janae. And I said, Colonel Ling, shall I escort the major from the TOC? And he said, I don't think so yet. And Janae sat down and shut his frickin' mouth. And that is a great example of the contempt that the active duty holds the National Guard in. I don't know how it is now. I retired 11 years ago. But that was one of the things that all throughout my career, because I literally came into the Guard, went to NCO school, and became a sergeant, was my conflicts with the active duty. And because I was really sharp, regularly active duty would try to headhunt me. Hey, come into the unit, do this. Re-enlist active duty. We can do this. And my response was always the same. No, thanks. I can make it in civilian life.
That's outstanding. Outstanding. One of my fellow sergeants who he had been active Navy and active Army. We had that discussion about how some things the active duty does a lot better, but there are those things that the Guard, uh, even like movement operations, how we were able to move a battalion over the pass to the Yakima firing center with and shoot, bring the equipment back, and be released at some ungodly time on Sunday night. Uh, but we could move and do an operation in a matter of days. What would take the active duty sometimes weeks.
Yeah. Oh,
to,
I concur.
to complete. And it was, and in almost every case that I was watching and listening to, it was always the same thing. It's like after they have a couple of months of regular training, they're just as polished or better than the active duty. And I think that advantage that we always had uh, wherever we deployed to was that civilian experience that our team members had. For we had those guys who could run a cable or set up a generator in places that the folks that were so structured
Mm-hmm.
in army protocols would take them days or weeks to get figured out. I remember the most ridiculous thing when we were in Kuwait was guarding this patch of barbed wire that had got ran over by one of the tribal folks. Uh, during a celebration, and we were required to keep an armed guard there at that 24 hours a day. And finally, I went over to one of the KBR trailers and asked, hey, could, could we get some concertina wire, like just three, three rolls? And we were able to set up and refix that little protective area just as good as it had been before. And it took almost 2 weeks to 3 weeks for people at Eruption to come out and take a look at it and like, yeah, we're not sure why they're keeping you here for this. This is fine.
Right.
I mean, we all that time that we wasted watching this flattened piece of concertina wire. That's the things that you're like there's no way that they can be this dense on something this
Oh
simple.
yeah, they can.
But yes they can.
Did what were you doing when we came back from the first deployment? What were you doing during Hurricane Katrina?
Going through my med board, trying to get my, I don't know if you remember, but before we had deployed, I got ran over.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
It's been about a year getting back on my. I just got medically released 30 days before we got activated to deploy.
Right.
And so by the time we came back, they were trying to decide if they were going to kick me out or not. And they found a compromise was like, you have too many things going on. You have too high of a profile to stay in your position. But if you'll go into recruiting, you can stay in.
Right.
Well, I wanted to wear that uniform longer. Like I was not ready to give that up.
Yeah.
And so I went to recruiting school and became a recruiter for till probably 06, 07. Somewhere in that point is when Sergeant Brown talked me into joining aviation because after I was finished with all of my medical requirements and they realized, well, wait a minute, you're an E5, you're a sergeant, you don't have the same restraints as an E4 does.
Right.
And I was able to return to fueling. So
Good for you.
The minute that I was able to the minute I was able to leave recruiting, I jumped ship. I went back to him for another year, but I went back to fueling as soon as I could, and it was on that try one, and I always share this too. If I had known about aviation, you never would have seen me in field artillery. I
Yeah.
would have. Once I went to aviation, I was like, this is the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it really was.
I was that way when I went to fire support. Frickin', if I would have known about fire support in 1975, that's what I would have done. I love being a forward observer. I think that's the most exciting.
The fisters,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that is the most exciting job in the military. And again, when we would do the gunnery exam, I would do the FDC slice, I would do the fire support slice, and I would do the gun slice.
I have lost my skills will perish if you don't use them unless you have the retention of this man. But I remember keeping my call for fire paperwork forever. Like or
Yeah.
little memo pads. Like I had that forever just to in that strange scenario. If I was ever in a situation where I needed to call for fire, and I kept that in my chest
Yeah.
pocket with your field artillery. You're thinking, hey, I may need this one day, and it was the thing I was most disappointed in was not being able to go to the 13 Bravo school. As much as I made fun of those guys, um, I really wanted to be able to take that school and have that shared knowledge and experience with them. I was all about I love all things about the Army when I came in. I wanted to know how certain divisions work with brigades or units or companies how they worked and I was very blessed in the sense that I got to go through 81st Brigade, 66 Aviation, 96th Troop Command, and then get to finish out with the 205th Regiment. So I got to see a very broad picture of how the National Guard works in Washington State, and I think it's a shame that so many soldiers never realize just how important a piece they are in that machinery
Right.
of how we work with the bigger army, and how our missions are planned way up here at Washington D.C. But even at the state level, there's so many things that potentially that you're going to be responsible for, but they don't get that buy-in from it. I don't think enough of the upper command shares that information with them, so that they understand it's like, oh, I'm not here just to sweep the armory every week.
Yeah.
I am, when the time comes, I'm going to be an essential piece of making sure this mission.
One of the best experiences I had in basic training was doing weekend CQ, charge of quarters, for Drill Sergeant Tomolno. And no, Drill Sergeant Kalma. And he was from New Mexico. He's a truck driver before joining the Army. I asked him, I said, okay, so we're a company and I'm part of 1st Platoon, 1st Squad. And he diagrammed for me every organization that he knew of, from infantry squads on up to attack helicopter battalions. And I learned how to do the drawing diagrams from him and what the symbols meant. And that was my introduction to map symbols. And I loved maps when I was a kid. But he was the one that helped me understand the structure of the Army. And you know how when you get into basic training, they're like, you got to know your chain of command. So when he drew those boxes, and I saw that at the time, we would have deployed with the 7th Infantry Division out of Fort Ord, California, and all these parts of a division, and how we would be fed as individual replacements into these divisions. And as an example, the NCO school there uh, at Fort Ord, that's where we were going to get our squad leaders and platoon sergeants. That he was the one that showed me how, yeah, you're a cog in the wheel, but every cog is important.
I was so it was in aviation when I was originally part of the 1/140th. I knew that the main uh, squadron was in California,
Right.
and so it was interesting. I got put in with 168. We were basically
Yep.
like a small piece of 168, but they transferred me into 168, deployed us with California, and we end up falling under the 140th when we get there. So it was like two extra steps to be a part of the original unit that I was supposed to be with. So it was really interesting, but it was it's a shame sometimes that we don't even know our sister units in other states that were like part of this big piece. And I got to speak with retired Command Sergeant Major Rick Stad a few weeks ago, and he shared one of those things that also had bothered me, was how a lot of our history in the Guard doesn't get taught, doesn't get explained to us.
Oh no.
Nobody knows the history of their units when they come into it, so you don't have that sense of attachment or that part of legacy of what you were a part of. So I definitely, again, part of my show is to not only share just how big the not just with natural disasters, but with this movement during the beginning of the war of being part of one of the biggest deployments since World War II, but letting them know that there's even a farther history back. I mean,
Yep.
I know we all get told about the Minutemen, you know, that 1636, that piece of it, and the Massachusetts rifles and that start, but we don't get to know how to the 146 actually got started. We don't get told how 66 aviation originally started, and it was good to start seeing some of the sergeants and first sergeants start sharing history. I don't know how good the implementation is right now, but I know that it was happening when I left.
Yeah.
That soldiers were finally starting to get to know, like, this is part of your history. This is part of your lineage. You know, you when you see this on the History Channel, you're hey, I'm a part of that. I was a part of that.
Yeah.
That's who we
So let me
evolved
ask you
into.
this. What was the first overseas deployment of the Washington National Guard?
I'm gonna say maybe the Spanish War.
Yeah, the Spanish-American War, 1900. The Philippine Insurrection and the Moro War, 1900 to 1902. I have a book about it downstairs. I also have another book, the history of the 66th Artillery Brigade, and a third of that book is the 146, which usually used to have 3 battalions.
No, I'm gonna pause you for just a second because normally they one of the questions that I normally ask, what are books that you personally recommend
Yeah.
to our folks
Oh,
watching,
absolutely.
and also are what podcasts or shows do you watch that you would recommend to our viewers?
I don't have any. This is the closest I've ever been to a podcast. Um,
I'm
and,
I'm fledgling at this. This is
no, this is
very
perfect.
good.
Good, we're both learning. But and I haven't watched television since 1975. I read. I like books, and that's why all those are there. And some of it is stuff I've written myself. Um, One of my favorite history books, I can't remember the author right off the top of my head, is The Glory and the Dream. And it ends at, I think, just as the Vietnam War is ending. And then there's the sociological history of the United States. And it covers everything like the chewing tobacco habit that visitors to the United States were so disgusted by because smoking wasn't as popular as you think and cigars weren't as common as you think. Most people chewed tobacco, and how everywhere you went there was a spittoon. So that's the 2 I can think of off the top of my head. I will give you when we break. I will go downstairs and I'll show you some of my historical books from the Washington National Guard. Now, when the Washington National Guard went to the 1915 Pancho Villa, my grandfather lived in Montesano, and he did machinery for logging camps. So when the call went out, he got on a horse, rode to Centralia, sold his horse to the army in Centralia, took the train down to New Mexico, went on deployment, came back, bought his horse back from the army,
Wow.
got paid off, and went home.
Wow.
And then he drove.
That's the good stuff.
Yeah,
The good stuff.
and then he drove trucks down to Longview during World War One because he didn't know how to drive a truck, but he told the army he did because he didn't want to go over the top in France.
I had my great grandfather. Uh, he he was a logger and coal miner during World War I, and I got to see his exemption certificate.
Right.
One of my cousins, and the reason being is it was kind of like the same as in England. They didn't want your coal workers or your loggers going to the front lines because they still needed the energy, they still needed the wood,
Yeah.
and so that was his. Uh, I'm pretty sure he would have went because most of the family we have since the Civil War we had or excuse me the Revolutionary War we've had family members serving, so it was kind of like one of those traditions that just
Yeah.
kept getting passed down. How now again World War II, 14% of Americans served.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're now at about 1% or less than 1%
Mm-hmm.
served now. And the majority of us that are serving or have served came from family members, or we come from that either a parent or a grandparent had served. Uh, do you have hopes for the next generation of soldiers and military coming through? I mean, it's to me it's to me it's boggling to have we're at the largest population that we've had, but the lowest number of those serving.
Well, since the change of presidential administrations, I know that morale has improved, but I do know that starting 5 years ago, a lot of people got out because of the sociological implications that the John Wayne legend of being a soldier was no longer being glorified. Instead, oh, look at me. I am a drone operator. No, frickin' young guys, young men are wired to uh, be aggressive. And rather than appeal to the people that actually fight wars, they wanted to appeal to the people that support conflicts, because a lot of the flowers that I saw that have gone in after since my retirement really kind of concern me. And on the opposite side, I've seen some real tough guys that did, and I'm thinking of one in particular, um, came in the guard, and as soon as his time was up, he was like, "If I'm not going to go to war, I'm going to leave." And when they off ramped the Afghanistan mission, as soon as his enlistment was up, he was like, "I'm gone. I came here to fight the war on terror, uh, not to sit through." Uh,
Briefings and safety briefings and
oh,
every type of yeah.
yeah.
I remember flying up to Iraq to do sharp trainings at I think it was a anyway, I was there for a week to make sure that our unit was meeting their criteria and their check. That I mean, it was a strange it was strange some of the things that we were requiring. Um, and I'm not saying that there shouldn't be education on certain subjects because I know that whole sexual assault culture at the beginning of the war was so much worse than by the time of my last deployment. Um, but the difference, I think, the reason that our unit didn't have as many troubles is because we were all male combat arms. We didn't have that opportunity for trouble to happen. It's and again, it's not that it didn't happen. I know that we had soldiers that got in trouble over there, but it's tough when you're trying to get that warrior mentality, that warfighter mentality, and you have a safety briefing on everything from running a lawnmower to
How to operate a butane lighter.
yeah, how to yeah. It just it was so crippling, and it just were lives saved. I don't know. Were fingers saved? I maybe. Um, but that type of mentality drove a lot of people out of the ranks
Yeah.
by the time we got back. And when stop loss was over, everybody was jumping ship when we first came back. And that was we watched this generation of trainings that were, some of them I still feel were very necessary, but there were some that were just, if your whole mission is worried about some of these trainings and not the actual training of warfighting,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to maintain that focus. It's hard to maintain that interest, especially if you're doing it 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks out of the year.
Yeah.
Um,
So
Trying to find that balance of how do we how do we check the blocks but still get legitimate training done? And I don't know if anybody has mastered that yet.
yeah, contrast that with 1975 when I was in basic training. Yeah, we had some dumb guys, but we had an imperative. We're going to go to Vietnam. We are going to pay attention. Medic school. Even the women learned how to. The Army was transitioning away from a separate branch, the Women's Army Corps, to full integration. And
Now,
so,
was this before or after the Buffalo Soldiers had disbanded? I'm just sorry. I'm
no,
just
those
asking.
regiments are still. Yeah, not all of them have horses anymore. Most of the horses died anyway. But my girlfriend, she went to Fort McClellan, Alabama for basic training. And they had their female drill sergeants, but they also had two male drill sergeants. And the male drill sergeants were there to put an edge on their training. And uh, the women, I never heard of a woman getting hit in basic training, but they were on their butts like they were with the males. And my girlfriend said the same thing. 2 weeks into basic training, I was like, oh my God, what have I done? This is stupid. Why am I putting myself through this? But they really put a beating on everybody in basic training, Army basic training in 1975. But they learned how to call for fire and they did machine gun training. Not all the people I talked to that did basic training in 1975 at Fort Ord, we didn't get to train with them, but we took pallets out to the beach and a couple of engineers came out with flamethrowers and burned them. Yeah, and the drill sergeants let us laugh and clap over that.
I will say the thing that I did appreciate, because being field artillery, we didn't have females, at least at that time.
Right.
I think they can now, but the thing I did appreciate when I went to aviation, uh, we had several females in the unit who outworked our boys, and I appreciated that so much. Just as a dad who has two daughters, like knowing that, okay, if my girls came into something like this, that there's examples in there of there was nothing better from that sergeant's view of watching these young ladies just work circles around some of the fellas, and when it came time to like who gets to do mission or who gets to do KP, the choice was really easy. It's
Yeah.
like I'm gonna take the soldier that works,
Yeah.
and it was so that piece I appreciated, but at the same time I know this is showing my age, in the sense I was always concerned about females in combat, and then again once I got to aviation and you meet some of the pilots and you meet some of the soldiers that are doing the job, it was getting more and more to the point where I was like, okay, we maybe we are in the dark ages on some things. Sometimes sometimes the when your female soldiers are out shooting your young men coming out of basic training, I was like, all right, I still don't want you shot or hurt in combat, but I sure appreciate your marksmanship over Private Johnny's
Mhm.
because he just whatever you're doing right, he's doing wrong. And it
Yeah.
was that piece of it. When did you start? I mean, I realize in the '70s you got to see that integration. At what point did you feel like, okay, this is we're we're moving on, we're advancing, or we're what's the right word? The I don't want to use equality because that's such a loaded question. But when did you get to see and feel that you weren't worried about the female's accomplishment or work ethic or um, prowess in certain fields?
On the whole, on the whole, half the women in the military, if they weren't in the military, they'd be on welfare. And having said that, half the guys that I know in the military, if they weren't in the military, they'd be in jail.
Yeah.
Um, One of the first things that impressed me about some of the things that women could get away with was when I was in basic training, I had to take something to a main office on Fort Ord, and I noticed how lazy a lot of the females were because people were afraid to frickin' chew on them. And that was something that I learned pretty early in the game was that there was a big game that the women could get away with. And I've had female medics that I just adored. Um, I didn't have an integrated unit until I went to Border Patrol duty in 2006. And that was the first time that I was the senior.
Were you with Master Sergeant Kraft and
Yeah,
German
I was a
and
sergeant
okay?
major.
Oh wow, right on. I wanted to be on that mission so bad, but
You would have been welcome. Yeah.
at that point, because of our first deployment, I was a single dad with 5 kids.
Oh my
So
God.
so that was Arizona was not in the cards for me.
Yeah.
But sorry, you were with an integrated unit.
Yeah. But and so I was in charge of all the Washington National Guard, Army, and Air Force guardsmen down there. So um, in that time, I welcomed, because they earned it, 2 women to the NCO Corps. And the first one we couldn't get in, it was a timing thing. But the second one, the state sergeant major, Sergeant Major Sweeney, came down and pinned Taylor himself. And that was one of the few times I actually got a little misty when I saw somebody, because she really did. She worked her ass off, and she never took a day off. And I have a driven work ethic, and I respect anybody else that has a driven work ethic. And the same thing with the other soldier that I got promoted to E5 before her. And there was some grumbling, but none of it was serious. Yeah, I was able to find a couple of stripes for some people that really earned it and frickin' pushed it up the chain that, yes, these individuals, whatever boards you're going to put down, are going to go to the top of the class. So,
I always again that thing about being in aviation. Uh, had Master Sergeant Hiking and she was Sergeant First Class once there, and uh, uh, Sergeant Thomas. They were two female NCOs who were readiness NCOs that were outstanding
yeah,
with whether it was getting you into the schools, whether it was tracking your paperwork, your awards, it was
yeah,
it was like, man, why why couldn't I have served under you know
yes,
10 years ago. I think some of my career projection would have changed and probably been a lot better.
Right.
Just because they they were sharp, they were on it, they understood the things that they weren't. It's not that they weren't worried about drill and drill training, but they were also very mindful about, hey, you may want to advance, you may want to go
Yeah.
AGR, you may want to be a technician, you may want to, they just did a great job of taking care of the soldiers. Because I remember I remember that fiasco of when we got activated and going to Fort Lewis and trying to get all of our records set in order. That I think it was probably the third time we go through our records when finally missing paperwork is finally starting to show up and get into place. And I remember the soldiers who, especially some of the older soldiers, that their paperwork was just gone or had burned up. Or you got people like Master Sergeant Kraft who still had hand typed. You probably did.
I do.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
was like had the hand typed,
Yeah.
paperwork, and their 2-1 file was like a
Yeah.
encyclopedia. And the rest of us were basically, it was just a little 3-ring folder
Or a thumb drive.
Yeah. Well, were they doing the yeah, I guess they did have them.
Yeah.
Did they have thumb drives?
Yes.
Yeah. Like,
During
okay,
the first deployment.
Yep.
See, and that's a great example right there. Is so I went to ANOC in '96, and core ANOC I did up at Camp Murray, and it was the first time I ever went to school, other than medic school, with women. And this was the biggest disconnect that the National Guard ever pulled on their own people. And if I was a lesser man, I probably would have walked away because of this. So about 1986, we got Apple computers. So I walk into the armory, I'm looking around for the typewriters, which we still had a few. I'm like, what are those? And they're like Apple computers. They never taught the unit members how to use them. They only taught the technicians and the AGRs how to use them. So I didn't know how to use a computer aside from a few tasks I did at Kmart, which were pretty simple, usually special orders and whatnot. I didn't know how to use a computer. I didn't know how to build a Word document or an Excel document, and I didn't know the difference. And that hurt me when I went to staff because I knew what I wanted to do, but thankfully I had enough soldiers around me that spoke Haggerty that was like, you want that on an Excel spreadsheet. I don't know what that is, but make me one. Let me look at it. I'll tell you if it's right. So when I went to ANOC, who had the advantage in core class? It was all the people that already knew how to operate a computer. So I'm turning in my classwork, handwritten, um, because that was acceptable. There wasn't a computer down at the library I could use, and good luck trying to get an AGR to let you use theirs.
Do you know my first computer was because I joined the Washington Guard?
Okay.
At that time, they were giving the Gateway computers.
I remember that program.
The ones with the cow came in the cow box.
Yeah.
That looked like a milk cow, and I had it for. I think after we came back from the deployment, we had to give them back, and I never understood. It was like, well, I thought this was part of, we joined that you issued this to us. It's like, no, you got to turn it back in now. So I turned it in. That was also my introduction to hand receipts and making sure that you got, well, basic training did a really good job on hand receipts. When I got to the state level, I definitely made sure I was keeping hand receipts at that point.
Oh yeah,
especially for a computer. But thanks to that, I started to get some familiarity with going, with getting on there. I had some training in college. I had been a graphic design student for a couple years, and but everything I did was still usually freehand. most of my artwork was all on canvas
Mm-hmm.
or paper or black and white photography. The students that excelled and went on to do more were the ones who understood how to use the computers, understood how to use Photoshop and freehand and those programs, and they went on to do bigger and better things. I went back to the mill work after the mill started opening back up again.
Right.
So it was that computer piece is huge, and it's funny how we take that for granted now because I I don't know. It's almost like they have to take your laptops and stuff away from you when you go to basic training,
Right.
and so that was just a different reality of by the time I was an active recruiter for several years, so we had our laptops, um, but that was a luxury to me, to be able to use a computer. Now it's a whole generation of we see the jokes, we see the memes about not being able to read cursive or write in cursive,
Mm-hmm.
um, but at the same time, it's that and typing are those skills that they're gone now. It's I'm just impressed with how far we've come in such a short period of time, but how much is already lost. We have a generation of soldiers who don't know what life is like without a cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
My very first cell phone was while we were mobbing at Fort Lewis, and I only got to use it for about a month. It was one of the Nokia ones that you
Mm-hmm.
could knock somebody out with. Were pretty indestructible. Um, I got to use it for a month before we deployed, and then I left it at home. Uh, when we got into theater, and I remember paying for internet at the internet cafes when they had built those. It was $5 for an hour, if I remember right, and I got on there maybe half a dozen times, and sent very basic emails home
Right.
saying hi, how are you, that type of thing. But I would rather spend money on a phone card because it had put in. Were you at the S Pod at all?
No, I
I was.
I went through everywhere. On the first deployment, I took the ship over
That's
with all of
right.
our
That's
equipment.
right.
That was that. It was like we need somebody. The brigade needs somebody to take the ship over. Haggerty used to work for Kmart. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so I went down to Beaumont, Texas, and counted freaking containers and looked for vehicles. We were we actually had almost 2 weeks to get that job done, and thankfully, Lieutenant Bratho, who's now Lieutenant Colonel Bratho, loved the woman. Her mother, Sergeant Major Debbie Clark, was a personal friend of mine, and she was the first woman that took me horseback riding. So anyhow, but so we got linked up, and we really did a good job. In less than 7 days, we had everything accounted for, and we had to take it as an article of faith that it would be loaded on the ship, which was kind of my job because I liked walking around down on the dock when they were loading. And freaking after working in a pulp mill and after being a logger and working in a powerhouse for 10 years, freaking walking around on an active dock was nothing to me, but it intimidated Bratho, and I appreciate that. But what I was saying about NCO school was the big difference came to when we went to the field. And uh, first off, none of the women could keep up. They had to hand off their rucksacks and their weapons to the big guys like me. So I'm carrying 2 rucksacks, a machine gun, and 2 M16s because none of the women could hack it, but they all passed. And that is the bad taste in your mouth about women being in the military is that even when they can't cut it, they keep them. And they're like, well, they have to answer to the same standards. No, they don't. And that infuriates me to no end that, especially in the Army National Guard, that they are not held to the same physical standards. They don't have the same physical expectations. And as much as I love all of my female soldiers, they don't belong in the combat arms. Um, yeah, being a pilot, even being up a brigade in FDC, that's cool. Medics, administration, mechanics. Freaking one of the sergeants that I promoted, she was one of the best mechanics I ever saw in the business. But as for being able to pack the gear and be a tanker, or I'll show you some pictures downstairs when I was a Cav Scout. Being a cavalry scout in a 113 unit is an incredibly physically demanding job because you have a 3-man crew that is carrying around the same equipment as an infantry squad. So you have your Dragon missile, your red-eyed missiles, you have all your heavy weapons and that sort of stuff. And if I'm sure they have been invented, but I've never seen a woman that could pack gear like that. And it is disgusting to me that they qualify women. Over 100 women have been qualified through Ranger School. And I know for an absolute fact that's.
You're going to jump right in on that battle of the sexes, that piece. I I'll go back to basic training, and I remember Private Walker, and I'll always have the highest respect for her because she literally was living in her car. She left a domestic abuse situation,
Right.
was living homeless in her car, joined the army so that she would have a place to sleep
Yeah.
and eat and all that. And I remember at the end when we did our FTX, and for whatever reason, this gal who is, I want to say, at least half a head shorter than me, um, is carrying an M60 for the final ruck march back, where you know if you pass this ruck march,
Right.
you graduate, you finish. And I remember her crying on the trail back because she's in pain. A lot of us were like, we had blisters where you didn't know you could get them. But I remember when they pulled her boots off and her heels peeling, as in the blood coming out of her boots, out of her socks and boots. And I was like, okay, that's a soldier.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a soldier. That's but I can agree with some of the especially the physically demanding ones. There are those times where
She would have died 24 hours into the Bataan Death March.
it's yeah, I think it all comes back to that thing of at least my generation, how I was raised. I did not want to see. I did not ever want to. You don't ever want to see your friend shot, but you definitely don't want to see a female shot, hurt, or captured.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And that's why the Israeli army doesn't have frontline females. Not really.
that was my that. So I was always curious about that because I knew that if there's the example of the great equal opportunity army, it's going to be the Israelis.
Right.
They use everybody, and out of necessity. When you only have a population that is, what are they now? Are they 10? There's not a lot.
Yeah.
There's not a lot. So you guess what? You don't have a choice. You come out of high school and you're serving. I believe it's at least 3 years.
Yeah, it's 2 years.
Is it 2
Yeah.
years? Is it? And so I'm just like, what a great. I know there's a whole battle of conscription and mandatory service, but I think what a great opportunity uh, to have your nation on a rotation of, hey, we all understand weapon safety, we all understand time of war, we all understand that we're all responsible for the defense of this nation.
Right.
And I that was one of those things that I was always impressed with everybody has a stake in
Mm-hmm.
that, because you might be a mom in the kitchen, but you October 7th, for example, it was like it took everybody to fend that off, and and uh, um, and it was everything about that was unfortunate, but it was amazing how, as a nation, they were ready to combat it.
Yeah.
Um, I was had nothing but respect for those folks, um, and it's a shame that we don't have. Um, I don't want to be that guy that I'm about our Constitution, but I'm also, uh, gosh, wouldn't it have been nice if we'd, I realized at the time that it was made, it's like, wouldn't it have been nice if we'd have had that in there? It's like, hey, you have an obligation to serve your
Right.
nation, because I think it is that great equalizer and connector, in the sense that you're going to come out with, even if you don't come out with a trade, you're going to come out with a sense of unity, a sense of you contributed to this nation, and I know there's other ways to contribute. I've met a lot of folks over the years who, either through injuries or medical conditions, that so badly wanted to join,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and were exempted from it. I mean, that's painful to watch when you see people are really, patriotic and all about our country, that they weren't, there wasn't an opportunity for them to serve, but you see that love and patriotism in them and their actions. Um, it's just too bad there weren't other forms of service that the folks who can't do combat, that could still be part of the the military discipline,
Yeah.
to be connected with all of it.
Well, to a lesser degree, the Peace Corps, as envisioned by President Kennedy, was supposed to fill that niche. That was one of them. And then years after that, AmeriCorps was supposed to kind of, the concept of national service. I think it was 1958 he brought back the draft, and and that was part of the reasoning. Well, after Sputnik, America was pretty scared. Um, we didn't have the draft prior to that because we had nuclear weapons, and we figured, it's not going to be a ground war. Well, when the big brains started looking at it, they're like, no, we're still going to need ground forces. And after Sputnik, um, like I said, not just America, but the free world was frightened. Um, and that's when really every NATO country brought back conscription. I think like Canada got rid of conscription in '72. Britain got rid of conscription about the same time we did. And the Vietnam War was a big contributor to why all these countries got away from conscription. Conscription was law in Germany, I think, until after 9/11. But everybody I knew from Germany and France, and I went to Germany uh, on a 6 month keep up in the early '80s. Um, but all of them said, it's national conscription. Everybody has to do it. Same thing in Switzerland. Every male has to join the military in Switzerland, and then you keep your weapon and basic load at home.
I just wonder how. Um, well, no, not going down fantasy road, but I do just wonder how much just the mentality and the interactions with Americans with each other, how different it would be if
Personally, I think it'd be a
things.
hell of a lot better. You know, all this racial tension and garbage I heard about subsequent to being in the Army in 1975, I didn't see any of that. I never met a Muslim until I went into active duty.
Same, same. It was one of those things where the one of the things I do miss about my time in the military is the diversity that I had, not only with uh, soldiers of different ethnic and ethnics, religions, just even political backgrounds.
Right.
I miss those interactions of getting to see and hear their perspectives on things that I don't, where I'm in kind of the thing about being from Lewis County or even up where I'm at now, it's pretty homogenous. You know,
Yeah.
I don't get uh, I don't get a lot of those interactions anymore that really just kept me from being that simple hick, you know,
Yeah.
in the woods. You know, they actually really opened up my perception to different, like hey, this isn't how it works in California. This isn't how it works in Atlanta.
Yeah.
This isn't how it works in Georgia. You know, it's so it really gave me an appreciation, even as a young boy when I was living on Navy bases or Whidbey Island, and you're meeting kids who, mom or dad might be from the Philippines or
Mm-hmm.
Japan or I really appreciated that growing up. It just like I said, it's it's a shame. I think about some of my fellow soldiers a lot. I'm like, I wonder what they would think about this situation. I wonder what their insight would be, on this. And you know, those are, if you want a world education, um, go into the military, because you're gonna learn that your view is so limited on what is actually out there in the world. And I think it's a great, kind of like Mark Twain, talking about how travel,
Oh, yeah.
broadens the mind, and it keeps you from being a knucklehead. Um, anyway, don't know where I was going. Totally went off on a tangent.
Oh, no.
It's those again, the things that I miss.
My stepdad grew up on a farm in Eastern Oregon. He never saw a black man until he was drafted into the army to go fight in Korea. And he was a combat engineer.
Well, that would have been in the
In 1950, he was drafted to go, and he went through Fort Ord, and they did engineer school, combat engineer school there at Fort Ord, and that was the first time he ever saw. Well, no, when he got to Portland at the induction center, that was the first time he ever saw black people. And so I grew up in Dallas, Texas, working since age 15, and in basic training, there were the McCormick brothers, and they didn't have electricity or running water.
Now, see, as a young kid in Virginia, I can still remember having an outhouse,
Yeah.
and I can still remember having a milkman. Um, Again, who my dad said could potentially be my dad, but only my mom knows for sure. That was It was interesting being with that group of soldiers who had some of those backgrounds, even